Welcome to Soft Spoken Mysteries, where we explore history's most extraordinary stories of human achievement and wonder. If you enjoy these deep dives into the past, please hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Today, we're going to explore one of the greatest survival stories ever recorded. A tale so incredible that when it ended, not a single life was lost despite impossible odds. In March of 2022, a team of scientists and explorers made a discovery that captured the world's imagination. Nearly 10,000 feet below the surface of Antarctica's Weddell Sea, perfectly preserved and remarkably intact, they found the wreck of a ship that had been missing for 107 years. The ship's name was still visible, arced across the stern. Endurance. But this isn't just a story about finding a shipwreck. It's the story of what happened before that ship sank, and what happened after. It's a story about 28 men who faced the impossible and survived. It's about a leader who refused to give up. It's about a journey across 800 miles of the world's most violent ocean in a 22-foot lifeboat. And it's about 3 men who climbed mountains that had never been crossed, hiking for 36 hours without stopping to save their companions. This is the story of Ernest Shackleton's endurance expedition, and it remains one of the most astonishing achievements of human perseverance ever recorded. The year was 1914. The world stood on the brink of war, but Ernest Shackleton had his eyes fixed on a different kind of conquest. The race to reach the South Pole had already been won by Roald Amundsen in 1911. Robert Falcon Scott had reached it a month later, only to perish on the return journey. The great prizes of polar exploration seemed to have been claimed, but Shackleton saw one last great achievement remaining. No one had ever crossed the entire Antarctic continent from sea to sea. It would be a journey of 1,800 miles across the most hostile environment on Earth, through regions where no human had ever set foot. It would require supreme planning, extraordinary endurance, and flawless execution. Shackleton called it the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition. His ship was named Endurance after his family motto, Fortitudine Vincimus. Through endurance we conquer. The expedition was meticulously planned. 2 ships would be involved. Endurance would carry the main party of 28 men into the Weddell Sea, landing at Varsel Bay on the Antarctic coast. From there, a team of 6 led by Shackleton would begin the crossing. Meanwhile, a second ship, the Aurora, would land a supporting party on the opposite side of the continent at McMurdo Sound. This team would lay supply depots across the Great Ice Barrier, ensuring that Shackleton's crossing party would have food and fuel waiting for them as they completed their journey. The Endurance itself was a marvel of polar engineering. Originally named Polaris, the ship had been built in Norway in 1912. She was a 3-masted barkentine, specially reinforced to withstand the crushing pressure of pack ice. Her wooden hull was over 2 feet thick in places, built from planks of oak, fir and greenheart, a wood so dense it was nearly impossible to work, but could resist enormous pressure. The ship was powered by a coal-fired steam engine, producing 350 horsepower, but she could also be sailed with all her canvas set, achieving speeds of over 10 knots. Shackleton purchased the ship in January 1914 for £14,000. She would carry 28 men, 69 sled dogs, and a ship's cat affectionately known as Mrs. Chippy, despite being male. The crew was carefully selected from thousands of applicants. Legend has it that Shackleton placed an advertisement in the Times reading, "Men wanted for hazardous journey. Small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honour and recognition in case of success." While no evidence of this advertisement has ever been found, it certainly captured the spirit of what lay ahead. For second in command, Shackleton chose Frank Wild, who had been with him on 2 previous Antarctic expeditions. To captain the Endurance, he selected Frank Worsley, a New Zealander with exceptional navigational skills who claimed he had dreamed about joining the expedition before even knowing it existed. Tom Crean, an Irish sailor who had been awarded the Albert Medal for bravery on Scott's Terra Nova expedition, signed on as second officer. The photographer was Frank Hurley, an Australian whose images would document everything that followed. His photographs would become some of the most iconic images in the history of exploration. On August 8, 1914, just days after the First World War began in Europe, the Endurance left Plymouth. By December 5th, after stops in Buenos Aires and South Georgia Island, she departed from the whaling station at Grytviken, heading for the Weddell Sea. The whalers at South Georgia warned Shackleton that the ice conditions that season were some of the worst in memory. Pack ice extended much farther north than usual. Many experienced captains advised postponing the expedition, but Shackleton was determined. He had spent years planning this crossing. He believed the Endurance could push through. For weeks, the ship worked her way slowly through the pack ice, sometimes making less than 30 miles per day. The ice was everywhere, massive floes grinding against each other, creating pressure ridges that rose like small mountains. Open leads of water would appear and disappear unpredictably. The ship would charge forward whenever a passage opened, using her reinforced bow to break through ice up to 3 feet thick. By January 15th, 1915, they were tantalizingly close to their destination. Varsel Bay lay just 200 miles to the south. They could almost taste success. Then on January 18th, everything changed. A powerful gale began blowing from the north, pushing the pack ice against the Antarctic coast. The pressure was immense. Individual ice floes were crushed together, piling up on each other, closing every leaden passage. By January 24th, the wind had completely compressed the ice. The Endurance was trapped. Shackleton ordered the crew to wait. Surely a southerly wind would soon blow, decompressing the ice and opening passages. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The ship remained frozen in place, drifting slowly with the ice pack. At first, the men maintained their routines. The ship functioned as a floating base camp. They played soccer on the ice. They hunted seals and penguins to supplement their supplies. Frank Hurley captured remarkable photographs of the ship locked in the ice, her masts and rigging covered in hoarfrost, creating scenes of otherworldly beauty. They celebrated birthdays and holidays. They held music nights and read books from the ship's library. Shackleton worked tirelessly to maintain morale, knowing that mental strength would be as important as physical endurance in the months ahead. The Antarctic winter set in. By late February, the sun dipped below the horizon at midnight, not to return for months. Regular watches were cancelled. With the ship immobilized, they settled in for the long polar night, hoping that spring would bring freedom. But the ice had other plans. The Endurance was caught in a slow, clockwise gyre that carried it northward, away from the Antarctic coast. By late February, they drifted within 60 miles of Varsel Bay, close enough to see where they should have landed, but the terrain between the ship and shore was impossible to cross while carrying the supplies needed for the transcontinental journey. As spring approached and the ice began to break up, new dangers emerged. The individual floes started moving independently, grinding against each other with terrifying force. The ice wasn't releasing the ship, it was beginning to crush it. On October 24th, 1915, the crew heard sounds that would haunt them forever. The ice was working, pressing against the hull with millions of tons of force. Timbers groaned and cracked. The ship's sturdy construction, designed specifically to resist ice pressure, fought back. But slowly, inexorably, the ice was winning. On October 27th, Shackleton gave the order that every captain dreads: abandon ship. The men salvaged what they could: 3 lifeboats, tents, sleeping bags, food supplies, navigation instruments, personal gear limited to £2 per man. They established ocean camp on the ice, just 100 yards from the stricken vessel. For 3 weeks, The Endurance remained partially afloat, her broken hull gradually filling with ice and water. The men watched their ship die slowly. On November 21st, with a final terrible sound of breaking timbers, the Endurance slipped beneath the ice and disappeared into the dark waters of the Weddell Sea. Frank Hurley had managed to salvage his most important photographic plates, diving into the ship's flooded hold to retrieve them. The images he captured of the Endurance in her death throes would become some of the most powerful photographs in maritime history. The ship trapped in pressure ridges, her masts tilted at impossible angles, her hull crushed like matchwood. Now the men faced a new reality. They were stranded on drifting ice, more than 300 miles from the nearest land. No one knew where they were. No rescue was coming. Their only hope was to save themselves. Shackleton abandoned all thoughts of crossing Antarctica. The mission now had only one objective: survival. He initially planned to march across the ice toward Paulet Island, where he knew a cache of supplies had been left by a previous expedition. But after hauling the lifeboats and supplies for several days, it became clear that marching was impossible. The ice was too broken, too unstable. They were covering less than a mile per day at enormous physical cost. On December 29th, Shackleton made a crucial decision. They would establish Patience Camp and wait. The ice floe they occupied would continue drifting north. Eventually, it would break up as it reached warmer waters, and then they could take to the boats and try to reach land. For 4 months, the men lived on the ice. They sheltered in tents made from salvaged canvas. They melted ice for drinking water. They hunted seals and penguins, anything to supplement their dwindling rations. They watched the ice beneath them gradually thin and weaken as they drifted northward. Life at Patience Camp was a constant battle against the elements and against despair. The temperatures dropped to 30 below zero Fahrenheit. The wind cut through their clothing like knives. Their sleeping bags, made from reindeer hide, were constantly wet and gradually deteriorating. The hair was falling out, getting into everything. Their food, their water, their lungs. Men would wake up coughing, spitting out mouthfuls of reindeer hair. Food was a constant concern. They had salvaged supplies from the Endurance, but those were being rapidly depleted. The daily ration became smaller and smaller. A meal might consist of a mug of hot hoosh, a watery stew made from pemmican, a biscuit, and perhaps some seal meat if the hunting had been successful. They were constantly hungry, their bodies burning through calories just trying to stay warm in the Antarctic cold. The ice beneath them was in constant motion. They could hear it working, groaning and cracking, shifting under pressure from wind and current. At night, the sounds were terrifying. A crack might appear without warning, splitting the floe. Several times men were nearly separated from the main camp when the ice beneath them broke away. Once a crack opened directly beneath a tent in the middle of the night. The men inside tumbled into the freezing water, screaming. Other men rushed to pull them out before hypothermia killed them. The crack closed again minutes later, as if trying to swallow them. After that, no one slept soundly. They established a routine to maintain sanity. Regular watches were kept. The scientists continued their observations when possible, though many of their instruments had been lost with the ship. Frank Hurley managed to save some photographic equipment and continued documenting their ordeal. The images he captured are haunting. Men huddled around blubber stoves trying to stay warm, tents battered by blizzards, the endless white expanse of ice stretching in every direction. Shackleton was everywhere, checking on his men, keeping spirits up with jokes and stories, organising competitions and games to keep their minds occupied. He understood that the greatest danger was not the cold or hunger, but despair. If the men gave up hope, they would die. So he manufactured optimism, projected confidence he didn't always feel, and made sure every man felt valued and essential to their survival. The dogs that had survived the abandonment of the ship were a source of both comfort and heartbreak. They had been intended to pull sleds across Antarctica. Now they were companions, but also a drain on precious food supplies. As the week stretched on, the terrible decision was made. The dogs would have to be shot. It was merciful compared to letting them starve, but it devastated the men who had cared for them. Mrs. Chippy, the ship's cat, was also put down, despite protests from the carpenter who loved him. Shackleton made these decisions himself, taking the burden of them so his men wouldn't have to. The psychological strain was enormous. They were living on a platform that was literally melting beneath their feet. At any moment, the floe could crack, plunging men into the freezing water. And always there was the knowledge that spring was passing. If they didn't reach land soon, another Antarctic winter would trap them on the ice. Another winter would almost certainly kill them all. Shackleton remained outwardly confident, but he confided to his diary the terrible weight of responsibility he felt. These men had trusted him to lead them safely. Now their lives hung by the thinnest of threads. He wrote about his fears, his doubts, his nightmares of leading them to their deaths. But in the morning, he would emerge from his tent with a smile, ready to face another day, ready to keep his men believing that rescue was possible. As the Antarctic summer waned and the floe continued its slow drift northward, the ice became increasingly unstable. They could see open water appearing in leads around them. The floe they occupied was getting smaller. At night, they could hear killer whales, breathing in the water nearby, waiting. The orcas had learned that seals and penguins used the ice floes. They would swim beneath the ice, then surface suddenly, trying to knock prey into the water. The men knew that if any of them fell in, the whales would likely attack. The cold was relentless. Frostbite was a constant threat. Several men suffered from it, their fingers and toes turning white, then black. The ship's doctors, Alexander Macklin and James McElroy, did what they could with limited supplies. They performed minor amputations on blackened digits, operations conducted in tents with the crudest of instruments. The patients bore it stoically, knowing they were lucky to be alive at all. Despite everything, Shackleton insisted on maintaining discipline and routine. There were regular meal times, even when the meals were pitifully small. There were duties assigned to everyone. The night watch was maintained. Scientific observations continued. This structure, this insistence on normalcy in utterly abnormal circumstances, was what kept the men from descending into chaos. As long as they had routine, as long as they had purpose, they could endure. On April 9, 1916, nearly 5 months after abandoning the Endurance, the ice finally forced their hand. The floe they occupied was breaking apart. Water was opening up all around them. At 2 p.m, Shackleton gave the order. Launch the boats. The 3 lifeboats had been saved from the Endurance. The James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills, named after the expedition's sponsors. They were loaded with everything the men could carry. 28 men climbed aboard and pushed off into the cold, dark water. It had been 497 days since they had last stood on solid ground. They had drifted over 1,000 miles from where the Endurance first became trapped. Now they were heading for Elephant Island, a desolate rock jutting from the Southern Ocean, the nearest land they could hope to reach. The journey in the open boats was nightmarish. Antarctic waters are among the roughest on Earth. Waves 20 feet high tossed the small boats like toys. Spray froze on the men, coating them in ice. Their hands were numb. Their feet had lost all feeling. They bailed constantly, desperately trying to keep the boats from being swamped. The 3 boats stayed close together when possible, but often the massive seas separated them. Each boat was overloaded with men and supplies. The James Caird carried 11 men. The Dudley Docker carried 9. The Stancomb Wills, the smallest and least seaworthy, carried 8 men crammed so tightly they could barely move. The boats were built for calm waters, for moving between ship and shore. They were never designed for this, for sailing through the Drake Passage in autumn storms. Steering required constant attention. One wrong move, one moment of inattention, and a wave could broach the boat, turning it sideways. Once a boat broached in those seas, it would capsize in seconds. So the men at the tillers fought the waves hour after hour, their hands frozen to the wood, their eyes straining to see the next wave coming in the spray and darkness. The cold was beyond anything most of them had experienced. Their clothes were soaked within minutes of launching and never dried. Woolen garments, heavy with seawater, provided little insulation. Their Burberry overalls were somewhat waterproof, but water found every gap, every opening. Underneath, their underwear, their socks, everything was wet. Their bodies were constantly shivering, burning calories desperately, trying to generate warmth. Frostbite was a serious threat. Several men could no longer feel their feet. When they removed their boots during brief rest periods, their feet were ghostly white, the skin wrinkled and soft from constant immersion. The doctors warned that gangrene could set in if circulation didn't return, but there was nothing they could do except rub the feet, trying to restore blood flow, and then put the wet boots back on and continue. Sleep was impossible in any meaningful way. The boats were in constant motion, pitching and rolling. Waves crashed over them regularly. The men tried to rest in shifts, huddling together for warmth in the bottom of the boats, but they were constantly soaked by spray and waves. Every few minutes, someone would have to bail out accumulated water. Rest periods were measured in minutes, not hours. The exhaustion was cumulative and crushing. Food consisted of cold rations. They had Bovril, pemmican and biscuits, but preparing anything hot was nearly impossible. A Primus stove would be lit, balanced precariously in the pitching boat, and men would try to heat water for a hot drink. More often than not, a wave would extinguish the flame, or knock the pot over. When they did manage to prepare something hot, it was the most precious thing in the world, a few ounces of warm liquid to ease the cold in their bellies. Thirst was as much a problem as hunger. They had brought water, but it was limited. Drinking seawater would kill them. So they rationed the fresh water carefully, each man receiving barely enough to wet his throat. Some tried eating ice or snow from the icebergs they passed, but this lowered their body temperature dangerously. They suffered from terrible thirst, their tongues swollen, their lips cracked, and bleeding from the combination of cold, wind, and dehydration. At night, the darkness was absolute. Without moon or stars, they sailed blind through massive seas. They could hear the waves coming, a roaring that grew louder as each wave approached. They could feel the boat begin to rise as a wave lifted them, but they couldn't see. It was terrifying, sailing into complete darkness, with walls of water all around them. Some men later said, those nights were the worst, worse than any storm, worse than any fear they had known. The absolute blackness and the knowledge that any moment could bring catastrophe. Navigation fell to Frank Worsley in the lead boat, the James Caird. He was responsible for keeping all 3 boats on course toward Elephant Island. But the weather rarely cooperated. Clouds covered the sky almost constantly. To navigate, Worsley needed to see the sun or stars, to take a sighting with his sextant. For days at a time, he had no observations. They sailed on dead reckoning, estimating their speed and direction, hoping they were still heading toward land. When the clouds did break, even for a moment, Worsley had to act fast. He would grab his sextant, brace himself in the pitching boat, and try to get a reading of the sun's angle. It required incredible skill. The boat was moving in 3 dimensions, pitching forward and back, rolling side to side, yawing as waves hit from different angles. Worsley had to catch the sun in his sextant's mirrors while standing in a boat that was essentially out of control in massive seas. That he managed it at all is a testament to his skill. That his calculations proved accurate enough to lead them to Elephant Island is nothing short of miraculous. For 7 days they sailed and rowed through conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. They navigated by Frank Worsley's skill with a sextant, taking readings whenever the sun briefly appeared through the clouds. At night, they huddled together for warmth, half sleeping, half delirious with cold and exhaustion. Men hallucinated from lack of sleep and exposure. Some thought they saw ships on the horizon. Others swore they heard voices calling to them. The line between waking and sleeping blurred into a nightmare of cold, wet misery. On April 15th, after what seemed like an eternity, they saw dark shapes rising from the sea ahead. The cliffs of Elephant Island. They had made it to land. The landing was chaotic. Massive waves crashed against a narrow beach. The boats were nearly smashed on the rocks. But somehow, all 28 men stumbled ashore onto the pebble beach. It was the first time they had stood on solid ground since leaving South Georgia 16 months earlier. Some of the men broke down weeping. Others simply collapsed on the beach. One man tried to walk and fell. His legs had forgotten how to move on stable ground after so many months on drifting ice and pitching boats. They lay on the rocks, feeling the blessed stillness, the absence of motion. For so long, everything had been moving. The ship drifting in ice, the ice floes rolling in swells, the boats pitching in waves. Now, finally, the ground was still. It was the most wonderful feeling imaginable. They had landed at Cape Valentine on Elephant Island's north shore, but the location was exposed to the wind and waves. Frank Wild scouted along the coast and found a better location, a narrow rocky spit that offered some protection. They named it Point Wild in his honour. Here they would establish their camp, building shelters from the 2 lifeboats they wouldn't need for the rescue mission. But their joy was tempered by grim reality. Elephant Island was uninhabited and rarely visited. It was a desolate rock jutting from the Southern Ocean, home only to colonies of elephant seals and penguins. The nearest human habitation was South Georgia, 800 miles away, across some of the most treacherous waters on Earth. No ships passed this way. They had no radio capable of calling for help. As far as the rest of the world knew, the Endurance expedition had vanished into the ice, almost certainly lost with all hands. The weather on Elephant Island was brutal. Gales blew almost constantly, bringing rain, sleet and snow. The wind funneled through the nearby mountains and hit the exposed beach with tremendous force. Waves crashed ashore, sometimes reaching up to where the men were camped, forcing them to move their supplies higher. The temperature hovered around freezing, but with the wind chill, it felt far colder. Frank Wild organised the construction of a shelter, using the 2 remaining lifeboats, the Dudley Docker and the Stancomb Wills. They created what they called the snuggery. The boats were overturned and placed on low walls built from rocks. The gaps were filled with whatever materials they could find: tarpaulins, canvas, pieces of tent. The result was a dark, cramped space, barely 6 feet high, where 22 men would live while waiting for rescue. Inside the snuggery, conditions were grim. 22 men lay side by side on the rocky ground, so tightly packed they couldn't stretch out without touching their neighbours. There was no room to stand. To move, men had to crawl over each other. The air was thick with moisture from their breath, and the wet clothing that never dried. Water dripped constantly from the canvas roof. The reek of unwashed bodies, wet wool, and blubber smoke was overwhelming. Light came only from small gaps in the walls, and from blubber lamps. Seal fat burned in makeshift containers. The smoke from these lamps filled the shelter, stinging eyes and coating everything in a layer of greasy soot. Men's faces became blackened. Their lungs ached from breathing the foul air, but the lamps provided a little warmth and a little light in the darkness, so they were tolerated. Food was a constant concern. They had salvaged supplies from the boats, but these would last only so long. The men became hunters by necessity, killing seals and penguins whenever possible. Seal meat became their staple, tough, oily, fishy tasting, but it kept them alive. They learned to use every part of the animal. The meat was food. The blubber was fuel for their lamps and stoves. The skins could be used for clothing repairs. Penguins were easier to catch than seals, but provided less meat. Still, the men became adept at harvesting them. Gentoo and chin-strap penguins nested on the island by the thousands. The men would club them, a brutal necessity for survival. They tried not to think about the trust in the penguins' eyes, the way the birds would waddle up to them with curious calls, having never learned to fear humans. Cooking was done outside when weather permitted, on a stove made from bricks and metal salvaged from the boats. When storms prevented outdoor cooking, they used a primus stove inside the snuggery, despite the danger of carbon monoxide poisoning in the enclosed space. Men took turns as cooks, preparing the seal meat in a large pot, often mixing it with whatever else they could find. Penguin meat, powdered milk if they had any, even seaweed gathered from the shore. The doctors, Macklin and McElroy, worked tirelessly to keep the men healthy. But with limited medical supplies and no way to prevent the cold and damp, illness was inevitable. Several men developed enteritis, a painful inflammation of the intestines. Others suffered from heart problems, their cardiovascular systems weakened by months of stress and malnutrition. Frostbite had taken its toll. Several men had lost toes, the blackened digits simply falling off as the necrotic tissue separated. Morale was perhaps the greatest challenge. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months. The men had watched the James Caird disappear over the horizon on April 24th. Shackleton had said he would be back within a month, but May passed, then June, then July. Still no rescue came. As winter deepened and the weather worsened, hope began to fade. Frank Wild proved himself an exceptional leader during this time. He maintained discipline and routine, knowing these were essential for survival. He organised watch schedules, work assignments, and entertainment. On clear days, he would climb to higher ground and scan the horizon for ships, though in his heart he must have wondered if any ship would ever come. The men coped in different ways. Some retreated into themselves, lying in their sleeping bags for days, speaking little. Others remained determinedly optimistic, joking and singing to keep spirits up. Some found solace in routine, taking pride in their assigned tasks no matter how mundane. A few, like the meteorologist Leonard Hussey, continued their scientific work, taking weather observations, documenting the wildlife, maintaining a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. But all of them wondered the same thing. Had Shackleton made it? Had the James Caird survived the crossing? Or had it been swallowed by the Southern Ocean, condemning both the boat crew and those waiting on Elephant Island to slow death? There was no way to know. They could only wait and hope and try to stay alive one more day. Shackleton knew immediately what had to be done. Someone had to go for help. The nearest inhabited place was South Georgia Island, over 800 miles to the northeast, across the most treacherous waters on Earth. After consulting with Frank Wild and Frank Worsley, Shackleton made his decision. They would take the largest of their 3 boats, the James Caird, and attempt to reach the whaling stations on South Georgia. It would be a journey of 800 nautical miles across the Southern Ocean, through the region sailors called the Furious 50s, where waves could reach 60 feet from trough to crest and hurricane-force winds were common. But Worsley believed it was possible. With favourable winds and his navigational skills, they might make it in a month. And a month was all the time they had. The men on Elephant Island were weak, their supplies nearly exhausted. If help didn't come soon, they would perish. The carpenter, Harry McNish, was tasked with making the James Caird seaworthy for open ocean travel. Using materials salvaged from the other boats, he raised the sides by 8 to 10 inches. He built a makeshift deck from wood and canvas, sealing it with oil paint, lamp wick, and seal blood. The mast from the Dudley Docker was lashed inside the boat, along the length of her keel for added strength. Rocks and shingle from the beach were sewn into canvas bags for ballast. Over 1 ton of weight was added to prevent the boat from capsizing in the massive seas they would encounter. Shackleton chose his crew carefully. Worsley would navigate. His skill with the sextant would be absolutely critical. Tom Crean would go. Shackleton had complete faith in his perseverance. The carpenter McNish would join them, as would 2 strong sailors, Timothy McCarthy and John Vincent. On April 24, 1916, 9 days after landing on Elephant Island, the James Caird was launched into the surf. It was a beautiful day, relatively calm, with a moderate southwesterly wind. The timing was perfect. It was the last day before pack ice closed in around the island again. The boat carried food for 1 month. They had two 18-gallon casks of water, though one had been damaged during loading and contaminated with seawater. They had two Primus stoves for cooking, paraffin, oil, candles, sleeping bags, and spare clothing. For navigation, they had a sextant, a sea anchor, binoculars, charts, a prismatic compass, and an aneroid barometer. As the boat pulled away from the shore, the 22 men remaining on Elephant Island watched in silence. Their lives now depended entirely on whether 6 men in a 22-foot boat could survive 800 miles of the worst ocean on Earth. Frank Wild, left in command, turned to the others. If the James Caird failed to return, he would attempt to lead them to Deception Island the following spring. But everyone knew that was a desperate, nearly hopeless plan. Their only real chance was that Shackleton would succeed. The voyage of the James Caird would become legendary as one of the greatest small boat journeys in maritime history. Shackleton established a routine immediately. The 6 men were divided into 2 watches of 3. At any time, one man would be at the helm, steering through the massive seas. Another would manage the sails, constantly adjusting to the changing wind. The third would bail, a job that never ended because water constantly sloshed over the low sides and through gaps in the makeshift deck. They sailed due north initially to clear the ice fields forming around Elephant Island. Then Worsley set their course northeast, aiming to catch the powerful westerly currents of the Drake Passage. His plan was brilliant but terrifying. They would deliberately sail into the region of the world's strongest westerly winds, letting those winds push them towards South Georgia. On the second day, they were 45 miles from Elephant Island, sailing in heavy seas with winds gusting to gale force. Water poured over them constantly. Their clothing was instantly soaked. In the Antarctic cold, wet clothing never dried. The men were permanently cold, permanently wet, shivering uncontrollably even when off watch and supposedly resting. Sleep was nearly impossible. The 3 men off watch would crawl into the tiny space beneath the canvas deck, but even there, water constantly dripped and splashed. The reindeer sleeping bags they used for warmth were old and molting, shedding hair into everything. Every mug of hot drink, every plate of food was contaminated with reindeer hair. Navigation became Worsley's obsession. To calculate their position, he needed to take a sighting of the sun with his sextant. But the sun rarely appeared through the clouds. When it did, the boat was pitching wildly in massive seas, making it nearly impossible to get an accurate reading. Worsley would wait for the perfect moment, balancing precariously as waves lifted and dropped the boat, trying to catch the sun's angle before clouds covered it again. On April 26th, 7 days after leaving Elephant Island, Worsley managed his first good observation. They had travelled 238 nautical miles. They were almost halfway to South Georgia. The news lifted everyone's spirits. But then the weather turned truly terrible. The wind increased to near hurricane force. Waves rose to 40, 50, 60 feet high. The James Caird would climb the face of each wave, pause sickeningly at the crest, then surf down the backside, completely out of control. One wrong movement and the boat would broach, turn sideways to the waves and capsize. The men took turns crawling out onto the pitching deck with axes to chip away ice that formed from frozen spray. If too much ice accumulated, it would make the boat top-heavy and she would roll over. Hour after hour, in the howling wind and bitter cold, they hacked at the ice, their hands numb, their bodies exhausted beyond measure. On May 5th, the 11th day at sea, Shackleton was at the tiller during his watch. The sky was clearing. Then he saw something that made his heart stop. Behind them, approaching from the southwest, was the largest wave he had ever seen in 30 years at sea. It was a rogue wave, a monster that towered above all the others. In the gathering twilight, it looked like a rift in the sky itself. Shackleton shouted a warning. He spun the tiller, trying to turn the boat's stern directly into the wave. If it caught them from the side, they were finished. The wave hit them like a moving wall of water. The boat was completely submerged, buried beneath tons of seawater. For a moment that felt like eternity, they were underwater, and every man thought they were about to die. But the James Caird was incredibly buoyant. She popped back to the surface. Water poured out of her as she rose. The men bailed frantically. Somehow, miraculously, she stayed afloat. They had survived. By May 7th, Worsley calculated they were less than 100 miles from South Georgia. 2 more days with favourable wind, and they should see land. The men allowed themselves to hope. On the morning of May 8th, they began seeing kelp floating in the water, a sign that land was near. Seabirds appeared. At just after noon, they caught a glimpse through the clouds. Land, the dark mountainous silhouette of South Georgia Island. They had sailed 800 miles across the most hostile ocean on Earth in a 22-foot open boat. Against all odds, Frank Worsley's navigation had been perfect. They had found their target, but landing proved nearly as dangerous as the voyage itself. The coast of South Georgia was ringed with reefs. Massive waves broke over submerged rocks. The rocky shores descended steeply into violent surf. They needed to find a safe landing place, but as evening approached and their water ran out, they had no choice but to wait offshore through another night. On May 10th, after 2 harrowing days fighting hurricane-force winds and nearly being swept past the island altogether, they finally found a break in the weather. They steered into a small bay, Cave Cove, near the entrance to King Haakon Bay. With enormous difficulty, fighting through the surf, they beached the James Caird on a rocky shore. They had made it, after 17 days at sea in an open boat, covering 800 nautical miles through the world's worst ocean. They had reached South Georgia. All 6 men were alive, but their ordeal was not over. They had landed on the uninhabited southern coast of the island. The whaling stations where they could find help were on the northern coast, on the opposite side of the island. Between them lay South Georgia's mountainous interior, a wilderness of glaciers, peaks and crevasses that had never been crossed by humans. Shackleton looked at his men. McNish and Vincent were in terrible condition, barely able to walk. McCarthy could not make the journey. They would have to stay with the boat. That left only 3 men fit enough to attempt the crossing: Shackleton, Worsley and Crean. They spent 5 days recovering, eating albatross chicks and sleeping under the overturned James Caird. Then, on May 15th, they prepared for what would be the final leg of their impossible journey. They would attempt to cross South Georgia from south to north, traversing completely uncharted territory. No one had ever tried this before. They had no map. They had no climbing equipment beyond screws threaded through their boot soles to provide grip on ice. They carried 3 days of food, a primus stove, a length of rope, and an adze for cutting steps in ice. On the morning of May 19th at 3 o'clock, they set out into the darkness. The night was clear and moonlit, perfect conditions. They began climbing immediately, ascending steep slopes toward the mountain ridges they could see silhouetted against the stars. For the next 36 hours, they would not stop. They could not stop. To rest in those mountains without proper shelter meant death by hypothermia. They had to keep moving or die. They climbed glaciers, cutting steps in the ice. They navigated around crevasses, sometimes having to backtrack when they hit dead ends. They crossed snowfields, sinking to their waists in soft snow. At one point, they reached a ridge and looked down to see Fortuna Bay below. But it was the wrong bay. They had missed their direction. Exhausted and dispirited, they had to turn back and climb again. Several times they reached points where descent seemed impossible. Shackleton would lower Worsley and Crean on their rope, then slide down after them. At one location, faced with a steep ice slope disappearing into darkness below, Shackleton made a desperate decision. They sat down in a line, one behind the other, and pushed off. They slid down hundreds of feet of ice at terrifying speed, completely unable to control their descent or see what lay below. If they hit rocks or a crevasse, they would die. But they had no other choice. The slope ended in soft snow. They picked themselves up, laughing with relief and terror at what they had just survived. As dawn approached, they stopped to rest. Worsley and Crean fell asleep instantly, exhausted beyond measure. But Shackleton knew that if all three of them slept, they might never wake up. Hypothermia would take them. He waited 5 minutes, then woke the others, telling them they had slept for half an hour. They staggered to their feet and continued. At 6:30 in the morning, they heard a sound that seemed impossible. A steam whistle. The whalers at Stromness used a whistle to call the workers from their beds at 7 o'clock. Shackleton told the others to wait. If they heard it again at 7, they would know they were close. At exactly 7 o'clock, the whistle sounded. After 36 hours of continuous climbing and hiking, after crossing glaciers and mountains that had never felt a human footprint, they were about to reach civilization. At 1:30 in the afternoon, they climbed around a final ridge. Below them, 2,500 feet down, they saw a small steamer entering Stromness Bay. They saw the masts of a sailing ship at the wharf. They saw tiny figures moving about. They saw buildings, smoke rising from chimneys, the whaling station. They paused and shook hands. It was the 5th time they had done this during the expedition. When they first landed on Elephant Island, when they reached South Georgia in the James Caird, when they saw the ridge and snow slope stretching below on the first day of the overland journey, when they saw Husvik rocks, and now this. But getting down proved extraordinarily difficult. The slope was steep and icy. They cut steps for hours, descending slowly. They crossed a frozen waterfall. They waded through a river. At one point, Crean broke through ice into a frozen lake, plunging up to his waist in frigid water. Finally, at about 4 in the afternoon, they approached Stromness whaling station. 2 young boys were the first to see them. The boys ran away in terror at the sight of 3 ragged, bearded, filthy men stumbling down from the mountains where no one had ever come from before. They reached the station manager's house. The manager came to the door. He stared at them, not comprehending what he was seeing. 3 wild men covered in grease and dirt, their clothes in tatters, their faces blackened by smoke from the Primus stove, their hair and beards long and matted. Shackleton said simply, "My name is Shackleton." It took the manager a moment to understand. The last time he had seen Shackleton, the explorer had been impeccably dressed, heading south toward Antarctica with high hopes of crossing the continent. That had been 18 months ago. Since then there had been no word. The Endurance was presumed lost with all hands, but here was Shackleton, impossibly, having walked out of the mountains. Within minutes, word spread through the whaling station. Men who had known the explorer rushed to greet him, some weeping openly. Shackleton's first thoughts were for his men. A boat was immediately dispatched around the island to retrieve McNish, McCarthy, and Vincent from the James Caird. But 22 men still waited on Elephant Island. Shackleton would not rest until they were rescued. The very next day he began organising a rescue mission. The Norwegian whalers offered their help, and within days a ship was heading south toward Elephant Island. But pack ice forced the ship to turn back. A second rescue attempt in a Uruguayan trawler also failed. A third attempt in a schooner was halted by engine trouble. For 4.5 months, the men on Elephant Island waited, their supplies dwindling, their hopes fading. Frank Wild maintained discipline and morale as best he could. They had built a shelter by overturning 2 of the lifeboats and arranging them over low walls of stone. They called it the Snuggery. Inside, 22 men lived in cramped, dark, cold conditions, wondering if rescue would ever come. On August 30th, 1916, Shackleton made his 4th attempt. This time, aboard the Chilean steamer Yelcho, he finally broke through the ice. As the ship approached Elephant Island, Shackleton stood at the bow, straining to count the figures on the beach. 1, 2, 3. Were they all there? Had anyone died while he was gone? Frank Wild saw the ship approaching. He shouted to the others. Men came tumbling out of the Snuggery. Shackleton called from the ship, Are you all well? Wild's response echoed across the water. All safe, all well. Not a single life had been lost. All 28 men of the Endurance expedition had survived. It remains one of the most extraordinary survival stories in human history. After the ship sank, the men had lived on drifting ice for months. They had sailed in open boats through Antarctic waters. 6 had crossed 800 miles of the worst ocean on Earth. 3 had climbed mountains no one had crossed before. And through it all, not one man had been lost. When asked later how he had managed it, Shackleton spoke of his sense of responsibility. He had brought these men into danger. It was his duty to bring them home. Frank Worsley spoke of something else. During that 36-hour crossing of South Georgia, all 3 men felt they were being accompanied by a fourth presence, something they could not explain, but felt strongly. Crean and Worsley later confessed to Shackleton that they had felt it too. Something had been with them, guiding them across those mountains. In the years that followed, Shackleton's leadership would be studied and admired. Despite the complete failure of his expedition's stated goals, he was celebrated as a hero. He had brought every man home alive, from a situation that seemed utterly hopeless. His decisions, staying with his men rather than prioritizing the expedition's goals, maintaining morale during the darkest moments, choosing the right people for each stage of the rescue, all demonstrated leadership of the highest order. Most of the Endurance crew returned to Europe and immediately joined the war effort. Several were wounded, 2 were killed in action. Shackleton himself served in the final months of the war, organising missions in Murmansk, but Antarctica continued to call to him. In 1921, Shackleton organised one final expedition aboard the ship Quest. He planned to circumnavigate Antarctica and explore previously uncharted sections of the coast. Several members of the Endurance crew joined him, including Frank Wild, Frank Worsley, and others who trusted him implicitly despite everything they had endured. But on January 5th, 1922, while Quest was anchored at Grytviken in South Georgia, Shackleton suffered a massive heart attack. He died in his cabin, just 47 years old. His wife requested that he be buried in South Georgia, the place where his greatest adventure had both ended and been saved. His grave lies in the Whalers' Cemetery at Grytviken, overlooking the waters he had crossed so many times. The headstone reads simply, Ernest Henry Shackleton, Explorer. For over a century, the Endurance herself remained lost, her final resting place a mystery. Many believed she would never be found. The Weddell Sea is one of the most remote and dangerous regions on Earth, covered year-round by thick pack ice. The ship lay under 10,000 feet of water in conditions that made exploration nearly impossible. But in February 2022, almost exactly 100 years after Shackleton's death, a team of scientists and explorers launched the Endurance 22 expedition. They sailed from Cape Town aboard the South African research vessel Agulhas Tiku, heading for the Weddell Sea with state-of-the-art underwater robots. Their search area was defined by Frank Worsley's original navigational records. Despite taking readings under the most difficult conditions imaginable, in a pitching boat in massive seas, with only 4 clear sightings of the sun, Worsley had calculated the ship's final position with remarkable accuracy. For weeks, the expedition searched using autonomous underwater vehicles, scanning the seafloor with sonar. The conditions were treacherous. Pack ice constantly threatened to trap the research vessel, just as it had trapped the Endurance. Time was running out. They had covered 81% of the search area and found nothing but a few pieces of coal and wood. Then on March 5, 2022, exactly 100 years to the day after Shackleton was buried in South Georgia, the underwater robots transmitted images that made the entire team stop and stare. They had found her. The Endurance sits upright on the seafloor at a depth of 3,008 meters. She is remarkably preserved. The cold, oxygenless water of the deep Weddell Sea has protected her from decay. The name Endurance is still clearly visible, arced across the stern, just as Frank Hurley had photographed it before the ship sank. The helm is intact, the rigging remains. You can see into the hatchways and along the decks. She looks as if she sank yesterday, not 107 years ago. Menson Bound, the expedition's director of exploration, said it was the finest wooden shipwreck he had ever seen. The ship cannot be recovered and will not be disturbed. She is protected under the Antarctic Treaty as a historic site. But the images captured by the expedition have allowed the world to see Shackleton's ship again, perfectly preserved, a time capsule from the heroic age of exploration. The discovery brought the story full circle. The ship that carried 28 men toward their dreams of crossing Antarctica. The ship that became their prison when ice trapped her. The ship they watched sink into dark waters. The ship that, by sinking, forced them on a journey that would become more legendary than any crossing could have been. She has been found, resting quietly in the cold depths, a monument to one of humanity's greatest survival stories. When we look at the photographs of the Endurance on the seafloor, when we trace the route that Shackleton and his men took across impossible distances, when we imagine 6 men in a tiny boat facing 60-foot waves, or 3 men climbing through unknown mountains for 36 hours without rest, we are confronted with a question. What were these men made of? How did they do it? Part of the answer lies in the selection of the crew. Shackleton chose men of extraordinary physical and mental strength. Frank Wild, who maintained hope on Elephant Island during 4 months of waiting. Frank Worsley, whose navigation found South Georgia across 800 miles of stormy ocean, with only 4 observations of the sun. Tom Crean, who had already proven himself on Scott's fatal polar expedition. Harry McNish, the carpenter who built makeshift vessels that survived impossible seas. Every man brought skills and determination. But perhaps more important was Shackleton's leadership. He made the right decisions at the crucial moments. When the ship was trapped, he kept morale high through the long winter. When it sank, he immediately abandoned thoughts of crossing Antarctica and focused solely on survival. When they reached Elephant Island, he didn't hesitate to embark on an incredibly dangerous rescue mission rather than waiting for uncertain help. When they landed on the wrong side of South Georgia, he didn't rest but immediately set out to cross the island. And he never gave up. Through 4 rescue attempts, through months of desperate effort, through failures and setbacks, he kept trying to save his men. The motto on his family crest proved prophetic. Through endurance we conquer. The Endurance expedition failed in every one of its stated objectives. They never set foot on the Antarctic continent. They never began the crossing. They lost their ship. They spent months in desperate survival conditions. By any measure of their original goals, it was a complete disaster. Yet it became one of the most celebrated expeditions in history, because in the end, they achieved something far more impressive than crossing Antarctica. They demonstrated what human beings are capable of when faced with impossible odds. They showed that leadership, teamwork, determination, and refusal to give up can overcome situations that seem hopeless. They proved that ordinary men, when led well, and when they trust each other, can achieve extraordinary things. Not a single life was lost. Through storms that should have sunk them, through cold that should have killed them, through starvation and exhaustion and 1,000 dangers, all 28 men made it home. That's the real achievement. That's why we remember the Endurance expedition more than a century later. In an age of satellite communications and GPS, of rescue helicopters and modern safety equipment, it's hard to imagine what they faced. They had no radio to call for help. They had no "and rescue coming." They had only their own skills, their own strength, and each other. When the James Caird set out across 800 miles of ocean, no one on Earth knew where they were or that they needed help. If they had failed, if the boat had capsized or missed South Georgia, the men on Elephant Island would have slowly starved to death, and the world would never have known what happened to them. But they didn't fail. They kept going when giving up would have been so much easier. They did the impossible because there was no other choice. And in doing so, they left us a legacy that transcends their original goals. Today, visitors to South Georgia can see Shackleton's grave overlooking the waters he navigated. They can visit the sites where the James Caird landed and where 3 men stumbled out of the mountains after 36 hours of continuous climbing. The Stromness whaling station is abandoned now, rusting and silent, but you can still imagine 3 ragged men approaching through the early afternoon light, having walked from where no one had walked before. And now, deep beneath the Weddell Sea, the Endurance herself lies in state. Her decks where men played football on the ice, her cabins where they celebrated Christmas and birthdays while trapped, her helm where Frank Worsley steered her through the pack ice, all preserved, all waiting in the cold darkness. The discovery of the wreck in 2022 captured the world's imagination just as the original story had. News of the find spread instantly across social media and news networks. Millions of people who had never heard of Shackleton suddenly learned about the expedition. A new generation discovered this incredible story of survival and leadership. The expedition team that found the Endurance made a conscious decision not to disturb the wreck. They could have recovered artifacts, they could have brought pieces back, but they chose to leave her undisturbed, a protected historical site. It seems fitting. The ship took 28 men on an unintended journey that tested the limits of human endurance. Now she rests in peace, having done her part in one of history's greatest survival stories. What the Endurance expedition teaches us is not about conquest or achievement in the traditional sense. It's about something deeper. It's about human resilience, about leadership that puts people first, about making the right decisions under pressure, about never giving up when others depend on you, about the strength that comes from trust and teamwork. When Shackleton set out to cross Antarctica, he dreamed of being the first to accomplish something no one had done before. He failed in that dream, but he succeeded in something far more important. He brought every one of his men home safely through circumstances that should have killed them all. He led them through 18 months of hardship and danger, making decision after decision that proved to be right. And in doing so, he showed that true leadership isn't about reaching a destination, it's about taking care of the people you lead. Frank Wild, Shackleton's second-in-command, said it best. When asked about the expedition, he simply stated, "Not a life lost, and we have been through hell." That's the real accomplishment. That's what makes the Endurance expedition one of the greatest survival stories ever recorded. That's why, more than a century later, we still tell this story and still draw inspiration from it. 28 men faced the impossible, a ship crushed by ice, months on drifting ice floes, a desperate boat journey across 800 miles of the world's worst ocean, a mountain crossing that had never been done, rescue attempts that failed again and again. Any one of these should have killed them. Together, they were insurmountable, but they overcame it all. Through endurance, they conquered. Every single one of them made it home. And that, in the end, is the wonder of this story. Not the ship trapped in ice, not the journey across the Southern Ocean, not the crossing of South Georgia's mountains. Those are remarkable, yes, but the true wonder is simpler and more profound. 28 men went into the ice. 28 men came home. Through leadership, through courage, through refusal to give up, through looking after each other when it would have been easier to give up. They all survived. That's the achievement that transcends the original mission. That's what makes this one of the greatest stories of human capability ever recorded. The Endurance may rest on the seafloor of the Weddell Sea, but her legacy lives on. Every leader who faces impossible decisions can learn from Shackleton. Every person who confronts overwhelming odds can draw inspiration from those 28 men who refused to accept defeat. Every team facing challenges together can look to the endurance expedition and see what human beings can accomplish when they work together and never give up. Through endurance we conquer. It was true for Shackleton and his men, and it remains true today. That's the wonder this story leaves us with. The certainty that human beings, when they refuse to quit and when they support each other, can overcome anything. Thank you for joining me today on this journey through one of history's most incredible survival stories. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the endurance expedition, please consider liking and subscribing to Soft Spoken Mysteries. Tomorrow, we'll explore another fascinating story of ancient ingenuity and human achievement. Until then, remember, the greatest human achievements often come not from reaching our intended destination, but from how we respond when everything goes wrong. Good night and sleep well.